Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another installment of Black and Beautiful Chit Chat Connections. We're going to chit, we're going to chat, and we're going to connect. I'm so happy that you're tuning in today, and I wanted to reminisce about our first episode. We got 100 views in the first week. So in 1 week, I just want to thank God for that. Like, people are interested in what we're talking about, and we're going on this journey. So I want to keep that same momentum. If you haven't seen our latest episodes, please go ahead and just click our channel and take some time and listen. Our episodes are not as long, and so we want to keep your attention, and we want to just provide you with as much information as possible. So there has been such positive feedback on this platform, about this platform, and that's how I know it's meant to be. So we're going to keep pushing. And like Minister Kevin says, we are going to put on our scuba gear, and we are going to dive deep into issues that people are facing in this nation as it pertains to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So tonight's episode is about emotional well-being and safety as a means to thrive. Now, we're going to go a little bit deeper than the surface tonight. And I want to warn everyone that some of the topics that we discuss on this platform will be triggering. Like, for example, our anti-Blackness. It was a very triggering experience because we were talking about the ways in which slavery was constructed in this country. We were talking about Willie Lynch, Letter to a Slave, and the slave domestication that took place in order for slavery to become an economic resource in this country. As a matter of fact, a lot of the old money that we know right now are descendants of slave masters. Are they wrong? Should they give up their money? That's a totally different conversation. We're just spitting the facts. You just need to know the facts. So do your own research, okay? But I want to warn anyone that if these are triggering to you, I want us to be a support system to each other. So if you're in the chats and you're in the comments, or you're having these comments with your friends, you're having conversations with your friends, you're intellectualizing the information that you learn here, I want us to provide uplifting ways to cope with the harsh realities, right, of life. I also want to share that not only BIPOC communities face hardship, we all face hardship in this lifetime. Life can be hard, there are obstacles. So let's uplift each other, let's love on one another, because obstacles are the inevitable. However, tonight, I would like to discuss harsh environments that are perpetuated in society through systemic oppressive structures. Yes, do you remember those? Go to episode 1. In episode 1, we went through a cadre of terms that we're going to be using on this platform as a means to just give you a foundation. So when we're talking, we could just move past it. So if you need a refresher, please watch episode 1, Why Am I Here? And you'll be able to go through, a 101 per se of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion terminology. So systemic oppressive structures was one of them. And so I want to provide some clarity around that. Someone came to me and they asked about systemic oppression and why it's white folks' fault. That was the question. Why is systemic oppression white folks' fault? And I want you to know systemic oppression is not one single person's fault. We were not there at the inception of their creation. These systemic structures, we were not there for them. Okay, so we cannot blame a group of people for them, at least, and at Imana Barrena, we do not blame people for them. Our goal, okay, is to understand that they exist and they have a heartbeat. And when I say they have a heartbeat, it means that innately they carry, the system that was created carries out its mission, regardless of who is exposed to it. And so I want to acknowledge that they're at play. And they are a part of the effects that we see in society today. For example, we can see division, whether it's social or political. We can see hatred, bitterness, exclusive practices, etc. We can see different ways that systemic oppression manifests itself in our society. And if we want to take control of our society as the next generation of leaders, it's our job to understand that they exist. And then as individuals, make a commitment to one another that we're going to be the reason why they stop and or they're reduced, okay? So that's what we do at Imana Barrena. We don't blame anybody. We just want people to understand that they exist and acknowledge that we live in a society that practices oppressive structures. And those oppressive structures are harmful to some groups. And because we're acknowledging that people are living a human experience, we have to ensure that, we look at people as human beings and we try our best to be good to each other, to be righteous and equitable to each other. So tonight, I want to explain how these oppressive structures cause harm by giving examples. And then I'm going to follow those examples up with some side effects. So yes, there are physical, emotional side effects that take place in people who are being oppressed in this country, in the world, globally. I'm going to stick to America because that's where I reside. However, I cannot negate that there are not some global issues that are happening and/or diversity, equity, and inclusion issues that are happening in other countries. For example, the UK. I follow a group on Facebook and it's Diversity Leaders of Tomorrow. And I have seen a plethora of DEI practitioners talking about oppressive structures that are in the UK. And so my brothers and sisters who are working on this work, who are practitioners of this work, I salute you. And we come in solidarity with you. And that goes for anybody doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work in this world. We need this. We need righteousness. We need equity. And we need people to be treated, for the content of their character. Treated according, to the content of their character. I think that that's the least that we could do as human beings and understand that we are having a human experience, okay? People are people. Don't treat people like artificial intelligence. That's not cool. So once again, social media plug. Do you all follow us on social media? I'm gonna give you a moment to think about that. If not, click on the link in the description and choose your poison. We have a platform, we have a page for every platform. So we recently posted a learning session. We post learning sessions on Instagram at Imana Barena Inc., shameless plug. And you would love to follow us on Instagram and stay tuned because we have a lot of learning sessions. And our last learning session was John Henryism. And we gave a little definition of what John Henryism was, Instagram definition, a scroll through definition. But tonight we're going to really get deep into what John Henryism is and how we can use it as a framework to describe some of the health issues that we see in certain oppressed communities in this country. So let's dive in. Put on your scuba gear. I'm going to take a sip of water. Put on your scuba gear because we're getting deep, might be triggering. Pause it if you need to, or just continue in this journey with me. I'm so happy you're here. So let's get into it. Now, according to the BBC Future, in an article named John Henryism, it is the hidden health impact of racial inequality, right? That's what they describe it as. But let's get into the story. So John Henryism is a story of a man against the machine. And we're not talking about AI machines. We're talking about the machine of systemic oppression. So in the 1800s, right, a Black American railroad worker by the name of John Henry faced a contest that would tax his strength enough to kill him. Now, according to the legend has it, Henry's job was to hammer metal rods into rocks, right? To get ready he hammered metal rods into rocks to get explosives ready. Now, one day he was pitted in a race against a steam powered drill, which required much less toil and threatened the workers' livelihoods. Now, against the odds, Henry beat the machine, but he died from the stress. And Henry's story inspired songs and books and films and eventually became a scientific hypothesis. So in the 1970s, epidemiologist Sherman James, who's now at Duke University as a professor in North Carolina, thank you so much, Sherman, for doing this research and giving us the opportunity to have this, intellectual conversation about how systemic structures play a role in the health of people of color. or those who are being oppressed. So epidemiologist Sherman James, who's now at Duke, noticed a troubling thing about the health of Black Americans. And it began when he came across a man whose life had remarkable echoes of John Henry's tale. In fact, the man even shared the railroad worker's name. John Henry Martin was a Black farmer who was also involved in an unequal fight against the machine. Now, the machine is in quotations because we're not talking about, in this case, John Henry from the 1800s. He really went up against the machine, right? To prove his worth as a worker. Now, in the 20th century, in this Black farmer, he went up against the machine of inequality, the machine of systemic oppression, right? So the inequalities of the rural South in the 20th century, right, caused this particular man, John Henry Martin, to be born into poverty. And he left school after second grade. He taught himself to read and write. And by the age of 40, he owned 75 acres of land in North Carolina. So, I mean, talk about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. I know that that is a triggering phrase, but this man became the anomaly. He made sure that he was going to be successful by any means. And I think that it's very important for us to walk away from this. I don't want to move away from all the people who are doing their due diligence to make it in this world. But let's continue in this story so we can see how systemic oppression plays itself out. So by the age of 40, he owned 75 acres of land in North Carolina. Now, determined to clear the loan for his farm, he worked day and night to settle the debt in only 5 years. But all that effort came with a cost. By his 50s, Martin suffered from hypertension, arthritis, and peptic ulcer disease, so severe that 40% of his stomach had to be removed. Now, not only did this story echo the story of the folk hero John Henry, the steel driver, but it also echoes the life experiences of so many working class African Americans that Dr. Sherman knew. And James will go on to study larger populations, coining the term John Henryism. The hypothesis predicts that when people face prolonged adversity against inequality, financial hardship, and racial discrimination, the high effort coping required to thrive will damage their health through stress. What follows is a greater likelihood of cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, and other problems. Now, I want to read that again because I want us to really understand what's being said. So Dr. James Sherman, he would go on to study larger populations, right? Coining the term John Henryism from these two folk heroes. The hypothesis that he would then the hypothesis that he would then come up with is when people face prolonged adversity against inequality, financial hardship, racial discrimination, racial segregation, residential segregation, the high effort coping. Now that high effort coping that we saw in both of these stories, one was that you work day and night. You work yourself to death, trying to cope so that you can thrive. But what that does is that can damage your health through stress. And what follows is a greater likelihood of cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, and other problems. So when we see that the African American community has hypertension, cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, and we're number one to suffer from these ailments, this hypothesis, John Henryism, begs the question that is it because of the high effort coping, that we have to endure? Is that why we have such a high risk of hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and all of these ailments that can be attributed to these high effort coping mechanisms that we face, the long hours, the, working extremely hard, the having to prove yourself, the fact that, I had a friend who was told, if you want to make it in this world, you have to be 10 times better. I was told the same thing. I have gray hair at a young age because of it. Now, I might not have cardiovascular disease, but I know that I've been stressed out. I know that I've had some depression. I know that I've been a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, I had to dig myself out of a hole, trying to gain my confidence back in some ways. I have a cadre of stories of ways that I've been, slighted in the workplace because of the color of my skin. Now, John Henryism, let's get back to this. It describes the stressful, damaging health impact of thriving despite inequality, financial hardship, and racial discrimination. So although we may overcome, and you might be that anomaly, like for example, John Henry from the 1800s, he beat the machine, the actual machine. Okay, he actually beat the machine, but it came at a cost. Same thing for our 20th century John Henry Martin. He beat the machine, but it came at a cost. He wanted to pay off his debt in 5 years, but did he actually get the fruit of his labor? Or was it premature? Was his death premature? So this is where I want to raise up. And I want us to put on our scuba gear to discuss, right? How does racism show up? Right? I'm going from discrimination, racial discrimination. We're going to stay on that same wave. We're going to stay on the same wave of inequality, financial hardship, racial discrimination, racial segregation, residential segregation, and what that looks like. And how does that play out, right? So racism can show up in what ways for somebody? So I'm going to use myself as an example. As I said, I've experienced racism in the workplace on numerous occasions, okay? And some of the racism in the workplace that I've experienced was due to toxic environments where microaggressions were happening, where blatant racist statements were happening, where policies and procedures were clearly not created for me nor the people around me who look like me. And so how did it show up? So according to how racism shows up, and you can look this up, right? There's a website called howdoesracismshowup.com, right? So it shows up in depression, health issues such as hypertension and diabetes. That's another disease that African Americans seem to be synonymous with African Americans in this country. Diabetes. High effort coping strategies, right? Coping is conceptualized as individual efforts to manage, alleviate, and/or to resolve life challenges and difficulties. And this is according to Lazarus and Folkman in 1984. Okay. Staggering statistic. Many African-American men likely encounter multiple incidents of institutional racism in different settings within a single day. And this is Mosley, Owen, Latosky, and Reese in 2017. They did a study. So they concluded that therefore efforts to manage, to alleviate, or endure the consequences of these incidents entails the constant need to adjust to the enduring demands of institutional environments, which can contribute, to severe psychological distress. And this is Mosley in 2017. So high effort coping strategies are conceptualized as individual efforts to manage and alleviate some of those challenges and difficulties that you face as a person of color in the workplace. I want to keep it to the workplace, because I think the workplace is a prime space for this toxic, racial systemic oppressive structures to just permeate, and it's very hard to cope. So as a person of color, you work those long hours, you try to work as hard as you can, you try to run laps around your coworkers in terms of your deadlines, getting them done early and moving in this fast-paced environment. And some of these work environments, they don't challenge that. They don't allow for mental health days. They don't allow for, just physical health days. They actually expect you to work that hard. And if you're not working that hard, you are then evaluated on that. You're evaluated on your ability to overwork yourself, right? For example, I was in a very toxic work environment. And I will say this environment was very toxic because when I brought up the toxicity of the environment, it wasn't received very well. And I was told that because, now this is an example in academia, I work in the college setting sometimes. And, while I'm in the college setting, a lot of this academia, there's a standard of Blackness that can thrive in those spaces. And it really is synonymous with keeping your mouth shut, putting your head down, or getting a PhD and doing all the same things. And so, as you can see, I have a platform. So I'm not necessarily trying to be quiet about certain things. I'm going to be honest and transparent and authentic. That's why I call this an authentic space with a professional twist, a professional space with an authentic twist. So I'm being authentic and saying, and this person responded to me and said, well, it's because you've worked in nonprofit and you have that grassroots ideology that you find yourself hitting your head against the wall like a donkey. Now, in the moment, right, I wanted to flip the table. I wanted to tell them they could go whatever, but I had to be professional in that moment. But what they didn't understand was me coming to them, right, was an effort for me to alleviate, right, some of the difficulty that I was experiencing while I was there, because I felt like maybe if I say something about it, maybe there'll be someone who says, okay, well, let's address this issue in a comprehensive way. How do we make this a less toxic environment for this individual and others? This might just be the one person who decided to speak up about it. But they decided to tell me that I wasn't working hard enough, or I was hitting my head up against the wall like a donkey. That was their response to me. I was reduced to an animal who shouldn't have an opinion and should just let somebody ride my ass. Excuse my language, right? And I use that word synonymous with donkey, and that really caused severe psychological distress for me. I was like, wow, I am being compared to an animal in this environment where I'm just asking for the ability to thrive, void of any toxicity. And that turned into physical pain. That turned into chronic stress. That turned into negative emotions about the job. I also had an arousal. I was on 10 every time I was in that environment because I didn't know who else was gonna, compare me to a donkey, right? So it was very harsh for me. And I'm not the only person that I know who's experienced that. Now I'm someone who's very vocal and bold, and I will speak out about it, especially on my own platform. However, let's just think about all of the individuals who are dealing with that currently in their work environments. Today's Sunday night. They have to go to work on Monday morning. Imagine how many negative emotions and the chronic stress and the physical pain that they're enduring, right? Before they even walk into the workplace or after they leave. There's another thing. And, I have some really amazing colleagues, my white colleagues, and we talk about these things, we intellectualize these ideas, and we talk about how we can be better individuals in the work environment. And this is something that Imana Barena does. We provide executive coaching for professionals looking to be that next DEI leader. And so I've been doing this for a while. And I've been having conversations, with some of my former white colleagues. And I always say to them, you're lucky you get to go home and you can close your window, close your door, turn off the news, and you can just be in your element, right? Once you leave work, you can leave work at work. But that doesn't translate for me as a person of color. I'm bringing home a lot of that stress. I'm also thinking about it while I'm at home. And the next step is the avoidance, right? So you have less willingness to take, academic risk or higher dropout rates after racial discrimination is perceived. So this is something that's happening right now, the great migration for Black professionals out of higher education. A lot of Black professionals are leaving because they no longer want to endure that toxicity. They no longer want to endure that chronic stress. If it's not aligning with my own moral compass, if it's not aligning with my emotional wellness, my emotional well-being, my ability to thrive in this space, my safety, I can no longer stay here. So if you're starting to see, if you are a professional or you own an organization or you are a C-suite member or you're a cabinet member and you're watching this and you start to see a migration of people of color leaving your positions, it's worth taking a look at whether or not your environments are toxic. And I know that's very hard because a lot of organizations don't want to admit that they have toxic environments, but that's the way that we actually implement diversity, equity, and inclusion work, by putting a mirror in front of our faces and saying, okay, we might have a problem here. And a clear indicator that you could have a problem is that your people of color have been leaving. You have a revolving door. And you can go back 2-3 years and see if you lose even one, if you losing your only Black person every single year, it's very clear that perhaps you have a toxic environment that needs to be addressed. So, I wanted to give you some insight into some experiences that I have had. And I don't want to speak for others, but being a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner kind of gives me a little bit of leverage. And that leverage I use by, providing stories as to how I've experienced them. Because a lot of the work that we do is going to require you to believe someone's story, but not only believe their story, but believe them as a human and understand they're having a human experience. Okay, so when BIPOC employees experience microaggressions or aggressions, period, they elicit high effort coping skills to process and deal with the constant exposure to racism and discrimination. All right. So when we're talking about that revolving door, we have to give you some examples. So if you are a person of color and you're experiencing microaggressions or aggressions, some aggressions are not micro, they are very, very blatant. Your high effort coping skills, you don't want to deal with the constant exposure to racism and discrimination. So you're at a heightened risk of the release of cortisol, enabling your fight or flight sympathetic nervous system response. All right. I know. Put on your scuba gear. Put it on right now because we're about to go deep. What did you just say, Charlene? Like I said, you have a heightened risk of the release of cortisol, enabling the fight or flight sympathetic nervous system response. Yes, people who deal with discrimination or have a high exposure to racism and discrimination, they actually go into fight or flight. Remember, I said, I wanted to avoid the job by any means. And when somebody said that I was like a donkey, hitting my head up against a wall, I went into fight or flight. Like I said, I wanted to flip a table and tell somebody where to go. I went into it. And scientifically, those who are exposed to high amounts of racism and discrimination will release cortisol, which is the 100% stamp of approval that that person's sympathetic nervous system has responded and they have gone into fight or flight. So fight or flight response is an autonomic physiological reaction to an event that is perceived as stressful or frightening. So once again, we're talking about well-being and safety, all right? Somebody saying they don't feel safe in an environment, somebody saying that the environment is toxic, this is what their body is doing. Your body is actually having a physical reaction to this. Okay, the perception of a threat activates the sympathetic nervous system and triggers an acute stress response that prepares the body to fight or flee. So the sympathetic nervous system then stimulates the adrenal glands, triggering the release of catecholamines, including adrenaline or noradrenaline. This chain of reaction results in an increase in heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing rate. I am here to tell you I went into fight or flight. When I was compared to an animal, and I was told that I was hitting my head up against the wall like an animal. Meanwhile, I worked 14 hours a day. I was always there. I was always reliable. I barely called out of work. I was getting sick because I was in and out of psych wards with young people who had psychosis. And someone told me that I was a donkey. I went into fight or flight, and I had increased heart rate. My blood pressure went up and my breathing rate went up. But in that moment, I knew that I was frozen a little bit, because I'm like, do I fight or do I flee? Okay, so we have alarm, we have resistance, and we have exhaustion. So one who is constantly exposed under chronic stress or have experienced trauma, you can get stuck in sympathetic fight or flight or dorsal vagal freeze and fold. And I was in freeze and fold. When this happens, it could lead to disruptions in essential skills like learning and self-soothing. So all of those other issues that we talked about prior to this, when we said physical pain, depression, health issues, diabetes, negative emotions, arousal, avoidance, these are all the things that can happen when you lead to disruption in your essential skills like learning and self-soothing. All right, so according to Harvard Health, chronic activation of this survival mechanism impairs health, the normal rate for fight or flight response. Okay, this chain of reaction results in an increase in heart rate, blood pressure, and your breathing rate. And after the threat is gone, it takes between 20 to 60 minutes for your body to return to its pre-arousal levels. That day, I stayed in my office for the rest of the day. I didn't even come out. I didn't even come out. I didn't even want to come out of my office. I was like, I'm done. And shortly after that, I decided that that position just wasn't for me anymore. I went avoidance. I went to avoidance. I said, nope. I was compared to an animal. I worked long hours. No one recognized it. It was a very toxic environment, a very, very toxic environment for people of color. I was called, somebody's black guru. People were just saying all kind of crazy things. And I was in constant fight or flight. I never felt safe. I never felt my emotional well-being was taken into consideration. I never felt like I could thrive, which also brings me to another statement somebody made. That same exact position, the same person said to me, you're looking to thrive in this environment. I can't help you thrive. I just can help you survive. So they didn't even believe that thriving was even a possibility. I just needed to learn how to survive, put my head down and survive, and be a donkey and hit my head up against the wall. Now, I know some people might be like, ha ha ha, that's funny. Maybe, perhaps that person just wasn't really understanding. And no. We need to understand that systemic structures in this country dictate the racial narratives that people believe. And based on those racial narratives, people act on those biases. And so that person was acting on their bias. They were saying, oh, you're a Black woman. You should be a donkey. You should be hitting your head up against the wall. You never should thrive in this space. You should always just survive and be happy with that, because we've given you an opportunity to be in this space among us. And that's the root of the issue that I would love for us to get to eventually as we continue to build, because I don't want to throw too much at you in one sitting, but I want you to understand how people function, the things that they hear, the physical reactions that happen, and how they could be detrimental to one's psychological and emotional well-being. And we don't want to cause that type of harm anymore. We just don't. We want to live in a society where people can feel safe, their emotional well-being is intact, their safety is intact, okay? High exposure to racism and discrimination is an unsafe environment. So if someone says they do not feel safe, this is what they're describing. They're in fight or flight. They don't know if they should fight or flee. Cortisol and adrenaline have been released in their body. They're having negative thoughts. They're having constant pressure, could be depression. Things are showing up. Physical reactions are showing up. And we need to challenge that. We need to challenge that. We can't have people going to work every single day feeling this way. This should be addressed. We should have comprehensive conversations with people about the things that they say to address their own biases so that they can stop doing this behavior, stop engaging in this behavior. So tonight, I just want to challenge you. Look up John Henryism. Take some time. Talk about what happens when racism happens. What are the effects of racism? What is fight or flight? What is cortisol? Harvard has an amazing article called The Downside of Henryism. And psychology at the University of Georgia, their department has a great article on racial trauma. Okay. And I want you guys to start reading about these things and thinking more comprehensively about how you can be an individual that stops, the toxicity that people are engaging in the workplace. We want to make this a better place. So I know that was a little triggering. I shared my little story. That's only one story. Child, I got a whole cadre of stories. Being a Black woman in America is not easy. Just being Black in America is not easy. As you can see, The Downside of John Henryism talks about how Black men endure racial discrimination at alarming rates. And so, our Latino community, our Asian community, people are under a lot of pressure in this country, and we just want to make it a better place for everybody. We want people to be able to show up and be their authentic selves, and including our white folks, but also be brothers and sisters in righteousness and equity. So John Henryism is real, guys. I had a really fun time putting on my scuba gear and talking about it today. We're going to talk about more types of physical attributes of racism as our podcast goes on. And we are going to just be in community with each other. I'm just thankful that you guys took some time to watch our podcast this evening, Black and Beautiful Chit Chat Connections. You guys are my Black and Beautiful family. If you have any questions, if you're interested in any executive coaching, know anyone who's interested in executive coaching, please let me know. Professional and executive coaching, please let us know. Click on the link in our description box. It can take you to every one of our platforms, and somebody is readily available to answer any of your questions. We love you. We thank you. Take care, and we'll see you in the next episode.